You are listening to Od západu nefouká, No Wind from the West, an architecture podcast produced by the Pěstuj, prostor Association. My name is Petr Klíma, and my guest is Christopher Long, an art and architecture historian. In the second part of our conversation, we will talk about Loos as a creator between evolution and revolution, about his Raumplan, which codified the life of the bourgeois household, or about Loos's bitterness at the end of his life. When you mentioned, I think, the key word evolution, which is, I think, characteristic also for his architectural work, because he doesn't leave tradition behind him. His architecture has its roots in tradition.
Yeah.
Although he is modern. But I just wanted to ask, was secession or Art Nouveau in Vienna around 1900? There had to be some zeitgeist which secession developed from. I mean, Loos was someone who advocates the modern way of life and modern architecture, but at the same time, it didn't happen just by chance, the secession. I mean, the ornamental forms had to do something with what was in the society. And if we think of Freud, of vital forces of our subconscious, for instance, and also there is no, it doesn't apply to 1900, maybe more 1905, 1910. There is no obvious seam between secession or geometrical secession and early modern architecture. So maybe I'm not asking you, but I'm just wondering that there are two contradictory approach to architecture, but both the approaches kind of develop themselves from the society in Vienna, and not in Vienna. Art Nouveau develops also in Brussels and Paris and other. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with all that. I'll give you another long-winded answer to what I think is the way to understand that, and it starts with a problem. Art Nouveau grew out of a problem. It wasn't an ornamental construct per se. It was a question. In the 1870s and into the 1880s, it started to be clear to those who were really paying attention that there was a disconnect between historicism, this revival of the past, and what was happening more broadly with industrialization and modernization and so forth. And the problem was that you could not readily or easily adapt, maybe not even possibly adapt, these historical forms to modern uses. So the question becomes, well, what then? And the answer to the what then, in many ways, starts in Krasnov with Ruskin saying, look, the other possibility we have here to evolve a new way of expressing these ideas is through the forms of nature. Art Nouveau is simply this recourse to nature on the one hand and a rejection of the historical past on the other. And it is absolutely correct that when it lands in Vienna, it doesn't come to Vienna directly. It comes to Vienna, Paris, Brussels, Lyon, and then eventually to Munich, and then from Munich to Vienna. So Vienna is relatively late in adopting the language of Art Nouveau. It actually hits Prague even slightly earlier, and that's because the Czech modernists were more closely attuned to Paris than the Austrians were. So you see that with Mucha, for example, right? There's a much more close connection between Prague and Paris than between Vienna and Paris in that period. You're also closer, quite literally. But the second issue is what you said. When it lands in Vienna, does it hit fertile soil? And the answer is yes. Because the really great thing about Art Nouveau is it allows, especially the nouveau riche, to articulate their own wealth and their own perceptions about their world. So yes, it is Viennese in the sense that it's very much about show and ostentation and so forth. So that initial wave of Art Nouveau, 1896, 1897, till you hit geometric Jugendstil, around 1901, 1902, is very much about that idea of ostentation and new form and so forth, and expressing this world of Vienna at the time. And then two other interesting things happen. The first thing that happens that's so interesting is that you get Hoffmann and Colamosa converting this language into language of pure geometry. Why? And the answer is because they start to perceive that that florid language is somehow out of touch with the reality of modernity. But one shouldn't confuse that language with the language of proto-functionalism, which Kotter and others use just slightly later, 1907, 1908. In the beginning, that language of geometric Jugendstil is still very much a language of form. It's a language of the surface. It's a visual language. It's not a language about the idea of functionality. But you put your finger on something else, which is really interesting, and that is this Jugendstil language part of this sort of Freudian world where you start to think about the interior world? And the answer is, I think not. So Hoffmann is working on the surface. It's always about a superficial idea. But where you do see that in a very direct way in Vienna is in painting and art. Because Klimt, quite early on, right at the time that the secession is being founded in Vienna, makes this transition away from historicism to painting in a way that's about the interior states of emotionality. It's really the beginnings of expressionism, although we don't normally see it that way. Klimt is the first sort of artist, important artist at least, who begins to think about this idea of pure emotionality and how emotionality can be depicted. And he does it in this very famous portraits he does of mostly of his female clients. It's then picked up by Kokoschka and Schiele and others, and becomes very much about this interior dialogue of thought. And that's much closer to the Freudian world. What Hoffmann is doing is terribly superficial, right? He's the architect and designer of the surface. And that's what puts Loos off. That's also why he essentially adopts Kokoschka, because he sees in Kokoschka something else. He sees Kokoschka as being the opposite of Hoffmann, being the opposite of the superficiality, because Kokoschka he sees is this artist of the interior, of this inner state. And all that's happening is so interesting. All that's happening very rapidly in Vienna within just a few years, 5, 6, 7 years, where this transition is made away from the superficiality of form into this expression of the interior states of emotionality. It's pretty remarkable.
When we are talking about ornament, I came across a notion about Loos's Raumplan as a spatial ornament. Is there something about it? I mean, could we interpret Loos's organization of space in the Raumplan as an ornament?
I think you could answer that question again in a couple of ways. On the one hand, yes, because the Raumplan still relies very much on surface. And in Loos's case, the surface of things that are materially rich, rich woods, for example, yeah, or color. One of the things that's not understood well about Loos, and you see this in Villa Müller when you go there. It's very colorful. It's surprisingly colorful. The colors, I think, shock people sometimes, especially when you go in the initial sequence, and there's reds and blues and greens and yellows. They're really quite striking, those colors. Yes, so that. But I would say that ornament in the Raumplan is also a kind of metaphor. Ornament is what you feel by looking at something, in a sense, right? You look at something, you get a feeling. And Loos's intentionality in the Raumplan is, I believe, strongly associated, and I did this in one of my books, as you know, the Novi Prostor book, the New Space book. It's very much about how one experiences any kind of spatial or spatial sequence. So yes, it's also about other senses. It's about what you feel. It's about what you see. It's about how your body engages a building, for example, through movement. And in that sense, yes, the buildings become conveyors of mood in the way that ornament becomes a conveyor of mood or conveyor of ideas or a conveyor of feelings. So yeah, in that sense, yes. Also because Loos is simply interested in surface. He's just interested in surface in a different way. Is a large wall of blue, for example, which you see in Villa Müller when you walk in and you walk to the cloakroom. There's this incredibly blue, remarkable thing. Is that ornament? In a certain sense, yes, right? A color field is a kind of ornament. It's just simply, in Loos's view, a modern expression of what that is, because it's about this material affect rather than the conversion of nature into a formal language, which is what Jugendstil is, right? It's the one, not the other.
When we talked about tradition and evolution, there is one thing that I was, when I was reading your book, also wondering about. What you are pointing out in the book is how Loos worked with Raumplan as a tool of petrification of a bourgeois model of functioning the family. Because what you say is that Raumplan is our performance, is about roles that the family plays and the servants too.
And the servants.
The residents of the house
well.
have assigned role, and the organization of the space follows the bourgeois routine, which is not modern. So Loos, on one hand, is in some way, in his original way, a modern architect. He wants to establish modern approach to objects of everyday use, for instance, and architecture too. But on the other hand, in his great projects, like Villa Miller is, he conservates somehow the bourgeois model of wealthy families. So how what do we think about it? I mean, because and there is a thing which connects it to his critique of ornament and critique of secession, because he discerns secession and its architects for prescribing the style, the style code for the whole domestic environment, the Gesamtkunstwerk approach. However, in his concept of Raumplan, he takes an utmost control of the family life.
It's a great question. It's the one essay I didn't write for the book, I should say. And I probably should have, but I didn't. Or I could have appended it to one of the essays. There's a way of thinking about Loos that helps us here understand what's going on. And it's a single word. Loos was a realist. So he's a realist about what he sees around him. And what he sees around him is that his clientele, whether it's in Vienna or Prague or Pilsen or wherever else he built, they were the bourgeoisie. That's who his clientele was. And they had a very prescribed way of living, very specific. And he responds to their needs in a realistic way. Now, what's so interesting about that to me is the following. Most of the modernists after 1912, 13, 14, and especially in the 1920s, they start to see that modernism is about the reform of everyday life. So what they're doing is they're creating interiors that show people how to live in a modern way. In other words, they are driving the new life. They are making the new life. They're creating it. It's really interesting in Taiga, for example, in his writings about the extent to he wants to create this new mode of living, right? He doesn't say it's already happening. Loos is a realist. He says, look, this is not how people are living. The people are living this other way. Certainly my clients are. And I have no need to prescribe for them a new way of living. I'm going to respond to how they live. I'm going to make their way of living enhanced, but not new. It should also be said that that's how Loos himself lived. He lived like a bourgeois, a kind of modernized bourgeois in a funny way, but he lives as a bourgeois. If you look at his apartment in the Bösendorfer Straße, and he's born in 1870. He's an old-fashioned guy in certain ways. He's not, he's a different generation, and we forget about that. He's significantly older than the other modernists. And in that sense, somebody who looks back. I said at one point the very funny thing that Philip Johnson writes about Frank Lloyd Wright, that Frank Lloyd Wright was the greatest architect of the 19th century, because Frank Lloyd Wright, in a certain way, was also a grand bourgeois in that way, and he's not wrong about that. Philip Johnson was just being wicked and funny, but he's not entirely wrong about that. And you could say that is almost true of Loos as well. And I say in the book, if Loos had lived longer, after 1933, he couldn't have built the same way because people started living differently. Particularly after World War II, in countries at least where people could, had the choice, they didn't have servants anymore. That world changes. Nothing about that grand bourgeois way of living survived. So he would have had to have built differently. And I cite in the book, this very interesting discourse that happens in around 1930 with the Tugendhat house, where they ask this question: can you live in the Tugendhat house because it's so modern? And the fact that they asked the question means that people had their doubts, that they weren't sure that this bourgeois way of living had changed and had evolved into something else. So even as late as 1930, an awful lot of people still aren't quite sure that that bourgeois world has eroded, that it's gone away. Grete Tugendhat, to her credit, says, "Oh yes, I can live perfectly well, and I can live my bourgeois life in the Tugendhat house." But the Tugendhat house is also a very bourgeois house in the sense that there's a very clear separation between the servants and the family, right? It's a very modernized bourgeois house, right? In that sense, and even Corbusier's villas of the 1920s are still very bourgeois in that sense, right? They're not a modern way of living yet. It's only when you start to get to things like the existence minimum or the kinds of things that Taiga is talking about, right, in the later 1920s and 1930s, that you really see a new concept of living, right? So Loos is, yes, old-fashioned in that sense, but he's also a realist. That's how people are living. That's certainly how his clients are living. And if you understand what he says in the beginning, that architecture is part of an evolutionary process, he's in that midst of that evolution away from the bourgeois modes of living into something else. He's just at the very end of it, you could say.
Chris, one of the topics and terms that you devoted one of the chapters of your book is the problem of discontinuity in the work of Loos. You mentioned how evolving was the character of his architecture, how evolutionary his architecture was, how it was connected to history. But on the other hand, the Raumplan concept is kind of a symbol of discontinuity of his approach to architecture. So could you give us an explanation on how was the ambiguity, if it's real a sign of ambiguity of Loos's work, or if it makes sense? I mean, that Loos still can have some ties and some substantial ties with architectural history, but on the other hand, or at the same time, he can also come with his completely original spatial design in which he discontinues his way of architecture with tradition.
That's a really wonderful question. It goes back to the very beginning of our discussion when we talked about how is Loos modern? How does he fit into this larger story of modernity or modernism? And there's been a tendency to read Loos either as a progenitor, as a maker of modernism, because he's among the first to develop an architecture that's completely taut and white, looking like the great international architecture of the 1920s. He does this already before World War I, so he makes these white boxes that seem to predict what's going to happen in modernism. And that's the way he's usually presented in histories of modernism. He's this forerunner or progenitor or pioneer of modernism. So that's one way to read Loos. Another way of reading Loos is the way we talked about already, and that is you have Loos, the bourgeois, who is working in an evolutionary way and continuing these ideas of modernism. So that's absolutely true as well. But it's also true that Loos does something as an architect that's utterly revolutionary, and he knows it. He even says it. And that is, he begins to think about architecture spatially in a completely new way, the Raumplan. And how does one explain that and be consistent with Loos's thoughts? And until you were asking me the question, I didn't exactly have the answer. And as soon as you asked me the question that way, I realized that he actually gives us the answer very early. In one of the essays he writes for the Imperial Jubilee, when he tries to define what it is, what designers should be doing, and he says, can you use things from the past? And he says, yes, you can use things from the past as long as they still have usefulness in the present. But if they don't have usefulness in the present, you have to discard them and make something new. And there's the key thought. Because what he's saying is, can you use an English 18th century Chippendale or Hepplewhite chair? Yes, because they're really comfortable. No problem, right? Can you use a Baroque candelabra and electrify? And he says, no, that's ridiculous. Because that's not what it was made for. You're going to make a modern light fixture, you have to make a modern light fixture. You can't adapt something from the past. And that's a really clear idea. So where does the Raumplan fit there? Well, he has one more sentence. If you can't make it from the past, if it's not evolutionary, then you have to invent it. And you have to invent it in light of what it needs to do. Well, that's an early articulation of functionalism, But for Loos, the Raumplan is an articulation of the function of the bourgeois household in a new way. So in that sense, he never says this. I'm extrapolating from his thoughts. But if you take those things logically, it's exactly what he's doing. He's saying, look, we don't have this form, but I have seen rudiments of it. And he saw rudiments of it from the English architects, from, also from Richardson and others. He was very familiar with that architecture. For one thing, it had been published. So he had seen it, and he knew what they were doing, and he knew this idea of creating sort of spaces on multiple levels. And then he works out his own idea, and his own idea comes, and again, we don't know the date, but it's expressed in the book that Kulka publishes, where how does he come to the Raumplan? He's sitting in a theater box, and he comes to this realization that that very low loggia that he's sitting in is not uncomfortable because he's looking at a larger space. And it's the relationship between the spaces that interestingly works together. And each of those spaces, and this is the important part, has a function. The loggia is compressed because it's personal and private, and you're looking out into the what? Well, into the public realm, which is what he does in the houses. It's what he does in the Raumplan very much. So it's a functional response to the problem. Is that consistent with his beliefs? He never says that, but it is. If you read, what he's writing in the bronze industry piece and so forth, it is actually consistent with what he's saying. He's saying, look, if you don't have this modern thing, or if you don't have this historical model, you could say the theater box is a historical model. What you do is you make something new. And he talks about, at that point, I think he mentions typewriters and rail cars and other things that have to be invented because they don't exist. So the Raumplan could be put into that group, I think, rather neatly. Nonetheless, it's really true that there's a kind of discontinuity in Loos. Because in the end, that bourgeois lifestyle doesn't exactly give you the Raumplan. It doesn't. There were other ways that he could have responded to that without creating these three-dimensional spatial puzzles. So is he being inconsistent in that way? Maybe, possibly. He understands that what he's doing is revolutionary. He uses the word, actually. This is the great revolution, he says, in architectural thinking. So he's willing to do that. He's willing to say, at some point you have to discard the past. And part of evolution is every once in a while evolutionary forms. And he would have known this from evolutionary thinking of the 19th century, that every once in a while things happen that are, completely out of the evolutionary sequencing. I didn't talk about this in the book, but, at least for our discussion, you and I, Loos is a 19th century thinker in the sense that he really does understand everything happening around him as developmental sequences. And if you think about it, the great thinkers of the 19th century, that would be Darwin, Marx, and Freud, all understand evolution as a developmental sequence, right? And that's absolutely who Loos is. He's absolutely thinking in that world. He's not a 20th century thinker in the sense that he's thinking about discontinuity. He's thinking about continuity, always about continuity and about how continuity happens, though he realizes that along the way there are interruptions. In Freudian thinking, that interruption leads to, mental illness. Something happens to you as a child, you don't turn out as a good adult. In the Marxian world, if there's an interruption to the system, then you don't get the right result. You don't get communism in the correct way in the end. And in the Darwinian world, he understands that there's disruptions. He doesn't understand what creates them because he doesn't understand about what genetic mutations can be. But he understands that there are disruptions, and those disruptions lead to new life forms, sometimes suddenly. So he knows that. Darwin knows that. He doesn't have a way to explain it because, he doesn't know what Gregor Mendel is doing in Brno and figuring all this out, right? And it would take a long time for anyone to understand, how genetic mutation was changing the course of evolution. But Darwin observes it. So all of them have this system of continuity with discontinuity. So, Loos isn't outside of that kind of thinking. He's actually really part of that kind of thinking, though he's not very articulate about what that means. And I don't know how directly he thinks about that issue.
And he's part of that.
But he does understand pretty early on.
Yeah. He doesn't say that, but he is.
There are moments when continuity is broken. And he seems to, he doesn't say, I'm part of that. He doesn't do us any favors and help us out with that. He doesn't say, I am part of that. but somehow he is part of that in the end. Yeah. So, yeah.
When I read the book, I was also wondering about Loos's words. He was saying that how the objects of everyday use are corrupted by our architects. So could there be, in Loos's eyes, an architecture without architects?
So the answer is yes. And Loos does write about this. He writes about this in two ways. He writes, for example, very much about the values and the wisdom of vernacular architecture. So this comes up in this essay, Architektur. And I write about this in the book before this one, the book of essays, Meaning, Context, Reception, or Význam, in the Czech one. So yes, he writes that very clearly on the one hand. You have to also remember that his father is an artisan and his uncle is an artisan. His uncle is a watchmaker in Philadelphia. And he has this enormous respect for craftspeople and how craftspeople work. And he says, craftspeople make things because they make things directly to function well. So Loos would have easily understood that you could make a whole set of things for everyday use out of this sort of craft tradition. And Loos's favorite example of this, because he actually lived it, was tailoring. He thought that tailors were the closest to realizing this idea of the expression of a modern everyday life. And we have an expression in English. We call somebody who dresses up and dresses very well and spends a lot of money on his clothes, we call them a clothes horse. It's a funny expression. And Loos was very much a clothes horse. He had a lot of very good clothing that he really couldn't afford. And no, because in those days you'd go and if you went to a very exclusive tailor shop like Goldbund and Salach, you'd order the suit, deliver it, and you got the bill once a year in January. And it actually happened to Loos that he couldn't pay the bill. And so in the end, he redesigned their shop on the Graben. That's why he did that first, shop for them, is he couldn't afford all the expensive clothing that he had. And the reason that he likes clothing is not only does he want to look good, but also he sees that this is a perfect example of where craft and modernity come together. That I'm well dressed in the most modern way. And the problem is that my suit doesn't look like the things that Mr. Hofmann is designing. My suit is, it's black, it's plain, it's well tailored. It's about good materiality. It's about craftsmanship. It's not about ornament. And so it's exactly that disconnect he sees. And to answer your question very directly, could you create a series of objects going into a museum or into an exhibition that were made by craftspeople? Loos says absolutely, clearly. And in fact, the way that you figure that out is you do something else that I've written about Loos. And we talked about this when I spoke in Pilsen some years ago. The very interesting thing that Loos does is he'll look at things and he'll say, well, that's good, that's bad. That's good because it expresses modernity in the right way. That's bad because it doesn't express modernity in the right way. He has this way of sorting things out. And so he could create that show quite precisely by looking at a whole array of objects and saying, that expresses our life, that doesn't express our life, because that has applied ornament that, for example, isn't in tune with the world we're living in now. And that's so very interesting with Loos. He's so adept at this way of thinking, and he's very consistent in his thinking. He doesn't contradict himself. He looks at something and he says, I know why that's good, or I know why that's bad, and I can tell you quite precisely. And if I look at something else that's different, but I can tell you quite precisely, and I can apply the same rules or the same logic to those things as well. In that sense, he's very clever.
And does he do that also in the 20s, for instance, in his late years?
Yes, he does it in the 20s, but he doesn't, he's not as discerning in the 20s. By the 20s, he just becomes bitter and he just, makes noise a lot of the time. So, in one of the essays in my book, I talk about how this architect, Roth is his name, meets him in Paris and listens to what Loos is saying. And Loos is just blabbering on. And I think partly it's because Loos is not as intellectually adept or as adept as a thinker in the later years of his life. I think that probably had to do with his illness. He had syphilis, and syphilis in its tertiary form, in its later form, begins to affect your mind. It's very clear when he testifies at his trial for child molestation in 1928 that he's a little not quite right in the head. So yes, I think from the mid-1920s on, he's just declining in his ability to think. He's not the sharp thinker that he was in 1909, 1910. And he's also bitter, and that bitterness, it articulates or expresses itself in other ways. So no, it's not the same Loos. Unfortunately, it's very sad to see his decline, but he's declining markedly in those later years.
It brings me to a question: can we use some medical approaches to better understand or better analyze his late work?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. It's difficult because he's not alive. We can't take him to the doctor. We can't examine him, but it is clear that he's declining. And we have the testimony of that. We see also the actions. Mr. Kulka, who worked for him in Vienna, Kulka takes over more and more responsibility for what's going on with Loos's work. And in Prague, Mr. Hotta is doing more and more for him. We also see that. And Hotta writes, in really interesting ways about this. He talks about how Loos needs more from him over time. He's got quite explicit about that, but you can kind of read between the lines and get that from what he says. And it's very clear that by the time they're in the last phase of working on Villa Müller, or even more importantly, the Winternitz Villa, that his assistants are doing a lot for him. They're making a lot of decisions that Loos isn't capable of making, or at this point doesn't even want to make. That raises the question, well, is this really Loosian? And the answer is yes, absolutely, because the assistants knew exactly what he wanted. They had worked with him enough that he was so specific about what he wanted. They knew exactly how to translate his wishes into built form. So, it's very clear, for example, that's the whole question that's come up now recently about Kulka. That's another essay in the book about, is Kulka making Loos's architecture in a Kulka way? And the answer is no, in my view, because if you look at what Kulka makes after Loos dies, it doesn't look like what he was making for Loos. It's very clear, even in the Semler residence in Pilsen, that doesn't look like Kulka's later work. So there's still something distinctly Loosian about that. And it's distinctly Loosian because they know what he wants. And he's involved to the extent that he gets what he wants. But is he declining? Yes, very clearly, especially in the last 2 years or 3 years of his life. After 1931, he was very much in decline. But I think that decline is already becoming clear by 1928.
When you mentioned Kulka and what is in the book, or what you write about in the book, it's kind of a reaction to the exhibition that took place in 2025, which was curated by Adolf Stiller and with the help of Stefan Tempel and Jan Sapak, and especially Adolf Stiller assigned more prominence to Kulka than before. Is there anyone else from the circle of Loos's collaborators who waits for more recognition? You mentioned Karel Hotta, there is Zlatko Neumann and others. I mean, because in another chapter, you describe how it was with Loos after Loos's death, how he became what he is now in the circles of architectural historians, and that it took some time. It took some time, and it didn't happen until 1950s that there was a partial recognition of his work. And it took another 10, 15 years, or we can also mention the work of Ruccio and Schachtel in 1980, the seminal publication. So is there anyone else who wouldn't be as important as Loos, but who would, maybe by you, maybe some of your colleagues, that we might be in any debt, like in terms of recognition or importance of his or her work?
That's a really wonderful question. It's a difficult question to answer because architecture is, I wouldn't say uniquely, but certainly among the arts, one of the arts that relies on collaboration. So there's no such thing, or almost rarely such a thing, as the individual architect who does everything. Nowadays, when we talk about an architecture firm, we're talking about large numbers of people who, if you talk about Herzog & de Meuron, for example, in Switzerland, well, yes, they're there, but they have quite a large number of people who are working for them, who are doing an awful lot of the work. And so, yes, we have this tendency to think about star architects, and we label things using the name of the star architect, and that's certainly true with Loos. What I appreciated about Stiller that I think is absolutely correct is that he points out very correctly that Kulka did a lot more than people realized. And he's right about that. I don't have any problem with that. And it's especially true with the later work. The work maybe after 1929, Kulka has a very, very large role in determining what happens and carrying it out and actually executing it. So there's nothing wrong with that. Where I disagree with Stiller is that he said that Kulka has a lot to do with the evolution of the Raumplan. I'm not convinced by that. I'm really not convinced by that for a variety of reasons that I talk about in the book. Where I think we need to go with this is an even better recognition of all of the assistants that Loos worked with. So Kriegerbeck, I mean, there were a lot of them. You know, he worked with many, many assistants over the years. At one point, Kulka lists all the German-speaking ones, but doesn't mention any of the Czech ones, which is really interesting. Tells you something about the times. But he makes a very nice long list of all the German-speaking ones who came out of, you know, the early years for Loos. Doesn't talk about any of the Czech ones. I'm not quite sure why, but I think that probably had to do with chauvinism. I've written about Loos's Czech assistants. I wrote about them in one essay. A number of people, including a very, very good Pilsen catalog that was done a few years ago, details all of those assistants as well. But yes, in the end, any architect nowadays in modern times is very much a collaborative venture. And so when we talk about Adolf Loos, we're really talking about Adolf Loos and these other people who work for him and with him. I think there's no question about that. And the best that a lot of that work's already been done, but done by very good Czech scholars, as you know very well. So it's been done, but somehow it hasn't. What I would say is it hasn't reached the international marketplace yet. So there's not the recognition outside of Czechia, I think, for the role of his Czech assistants yet. Hopefully that will come. I think it's better understood inside of Czechia.
And what will you be working on, or what are you working on right now? Because the texts, when I read the preface, stated by June or July.
So I finished all the essays except for the last one about Kulka in the summer, and then I got the catalog from the Kulka piece, and I added that essay. I should also note for your readers that there's a Czech language translation in the works. I do that very deliberately. It's very important to me to speak to the Czech audience as well in a way that's a little more easy to read than the English version. So that's important. I'm working on a variety of other projects. I've done several books recently about graphic design. I'm working on a new book on American graphic design, early graphic design. I'm working on a book on an idea I've had for some years about why the Viennese in particular were so interested in that evolutionary idea that Loos talks about, where they continued to use historical forms long after the modernists in other places reject them. Josef Frank is a lovely example of that, where Frank doesn't ever fully reject the past. It's not the Corbusian idea where you reject the past. And so I want to talk about what that means and how that is. That's the next book project that I have. And I'm toying with the idea, which I probably will do, to write a biography of Loos. Not to replace Ruxio and Shackley, because that's, that for one thing, that's more work than I want to do. I hope somebody will do that and add to the Catalogue Raisonné, because there's some things to add now to the Catalogue Raisonné. That's a wonderful book, and that book can't be replaced exactly. But I'm thinking about writing something that I'm calling a critical biography, which has rather more to do with Loos's thoughts than it does with Loos's buildings, except to the extent that his thoughts are inherent in his work. I've already approached a publisher in the US, Yale University Press, about that idea. They said they'd love that, so I might do that towards the end of next year. It'll take me a little while to write that book because it's not so easy to do. But yeah, that's in my thoughts about other future projects. So graphic design, something about this idea of historical continuity in Viennese design, and then a critical biography of Loos, I think.
Chris, thank you very much. I'm sure that there will be another book of essays on Loos, written by you. I mean,
I don't know. I hope not. I actually have an idea. If I do another book of essays, it might be a book of essays on more broadly on Central European
Yeah.
architects and thinkers, because I've long wanted to write some other figures. Taiga is an interesting figure. Janak is an interesting figure. I mean, there's some very interesting things happening in the intellectual discourse of Czechia in that period. And my ability to read Czech is terrible, but if I'm patient with it, I do get through it. At least I pretend that I know what's happening. I think mostly between me and the translator, I can figure it out. But also some of the Viennese thinkers. I'm really interested in talking about people that are not Loos. So honestly, I didn't mention it, but I should have, that I'm also working on volume 4 of the complete writings of Josef Frank. So that's in process. That should be done sometime next year. And those are the later theoretical essays. So all the essays of the later 1930s, 40s, and 50s that were not published. The translator's working on them now, write a longish introduction, and that book should be out in English and German in later next year sometime, I think. Yeah. Someday we need to find a Czech translator for that whole book.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Chris, it was an honor. Thank you very much for taking part in our podcast, and I hope see you soon and hear you soon.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Petr. All right. Ciao, ciao.
I am Petr Klíma, and this was another episode of the law series of the architecture podcast Od západu nefouká, No Wind from the West. Today with art, design, and architecture historian Christopher Long, professor of the University of Texas in Austin. All episodes of the podcast can be found on the website odzápadunefouká.cz, on YouTube, and on the usual podcast platforms. Thank you for listening. We would also appreciate your feedback.